why quantum if we want to talk about chemical reactions. And essentially it's because physicists divide the world into two areas. One is the set of laws, which are classical mechanics that describe how large systems behave, how we can launch rockets or why planets rotate. And that is essentially Newton's laws. And then we have the set of theories that describe how the small behave, so the nanoscale and below that, and that is quantum mechanics. So here we're going to be talking about chemistry from the molecules, the atoms, and the electrons point of view. Our dream is to be able to simulate quantum chemistry in a computer in a fast and reliable way. So if we continue with the classical comparison, when it comes to engineering objects at a human scale, so when it comes to designing engines for an aeroplane, for example, we can do most of those engineering decisions based on calculations on a computer. So when it comes to Newton's laws, we rely a lot on simulations on a computer. But nowadays, technology is looking more and more at the nanoscale because we want to design new drugs or we want to improve the battery of our iPhones. And that requires nanotechnology, which means it requires quantum mechanics. But engineering at the nanoscale is still very stuck in the lab because quantum simulations are not as reliable as classical simulations, and they are not fast enough either. So there's three things we can do. We can speed up our labs by introducing robots into them, and some institutes are already doing that. We can wait until quantum computers are big enough and fast enough, and there's some talks about quantum computing too. Or we can improve our current simulations so that they can be run in classical computers, but they become more efficient and so that we can rely on them. And that third part is where I belong, is the type of work I'm going to talk about, and is the work we do in my team. So essentially, the main equation in quantum mechanics, which is written down here, is the Schrödinger equation, and is the equivalent of Newton's laws, but for quantum mechanics, was already known by 1926. And at that time, Paul Dirac, which was one of the two Nobel Prize winners for that task, said this famous quote, or at least we think it's famous, and he said that the underlying physical laws that are necessary for the mathematical theory of a large part of quantum physics and the whole of chemistry are completely known, which means that by now I shouldn't have a job because everything is done. But the quote continued, and he said that the difficulty is only that the exact application of these laws leads to equations that are much too complicated to be solved. So essentially, he said, our only task is to solve these equations, but that's very complicated. And that's what we've been trying to do since then. So yeah, we haven't fixed it. But why is it so complicated? So if we look at a molecule like the caffeine molecule, which is not a very big molecule, it contains 102 electrons, which are shown here in this light green color, and then the blue and red spheres are the nuclei of the atoms. If we could treat this molecule like a classical object, like a moving train, to compute its energy, we would only need the positions and the velocities of the nuclei and the electrons. So that's an easy task because we just need 102 electron velocities and 102 nuclei velocities. So that's easy from the classical mechanics point of view. But we know this is a molecule, so it's a tiny object, and we need quantum mechanics to describe it. And in that case, a key ingredient in quantum mechanics is that you cannot determine completely and with complete certainty the speed and the position of the electrons. And therefore, instead of keeping track of 102 numbers, you have to keep track of the probability of finding each electron at each possible position. And that probability is described by the square of a function that we call the wave function, which you've seen in the previous equation. So to compute the total energy in quantum mechanics via the Schrödinger equation, you need to find the wave function. And that is a joint probability distribution, which means it's a huge function that contains inside all possible combinations of where to find the electrons. And that is a function that increases with the number of electrons exponentially. So very quickly, it becomes a problem that we cannot even store, even if we could solve for the wave function. So as a spoiler for the rest of the talk, when it comes to computing things in quantum chemistry, theoretical people do not follow this approach very often, because as soon as you want to take into account a few electrons, you cannot deal with them. So there's other alternatives that I will introduce later. So I hopefully convinced you that this is a complicated problem, but now I want to convince you of why we care about it, because if it's complicated, we could also decide to ignore it, right? So quantum chemistry is the understanding of chemical reactions from the point of view of the energies and the states of the electrons. And here I want to take you on a small detour to show you an example where of the power of quantum chemistry. So just bear with me. Let's try to think of how can we make a more sustainable fertilizer. And that's a very important question, because fertilizers are fundamental for the agricultural industry, which is feeding all of us, and it's also feeding the animals that we also eat. So it's a very important question. And I'm going to show some facts. The first fact is phosphorus and nitrogen are the main chemical elements that plants need to grow. So something that industry does is they take a molecule that contains phosphorus and they mix it with ammonia, because ammonia is a molecule that contains nitrogen. They bring them together and they produce a complete fertilizer that then they give to plants. The country we are in today has the biggest phosphate rock natural reserve in the world, which means they have the main ingredient for this complete fertilizer, because nitrogen and hydrogen for ammonia, you can get them from the air we breathe. So Morocco is one of the biggest fertilizers producers in the world. However, the production of ammonia accounts for 2% of the global CO2 emissions in the world, and it also is responsible for 80% of the cost of the variable cost of fertilizers in Morocco. And that is very shocking to me, because in Morocco, you already have the main ingredient, which is the phosphorus. The other things you get from air. So what is the reason for that? And the reason for that is that the only way industry knows how to make ammonia is through this process. They take nitrogen, they mix it with hydrogen, but they need 400 Celsius degrees for that, and also very high pressures. And also, in order for this reaction to take place, you need to have your reactants on top of a catalyst, on top of a surface of iron that is not getting involved in the reaction, but is making the reaction possible. So it's helping the reaction to take place. This is very far from ideal, right? Because the fact that you need to get to up to 400 Celsius degrees explains why you need to expend so much energy, and also explains why our food becomes much more expensive when fuel goes up, fuel prices goes up. So we want to improve this methodology. And we know that nature does it much better. So we know that bacteria, like the one shown here, they produce ammonia, and they do it perfectly fine at 25 Celsius degrees, just at room temperature. And the reason for that is that instead of using iron, they use a much more complicated thing, which is nitrogenase. Is this enzyme shown here that contains thousands of atoms, and it's a more complex catalyst that is helping for this reaction in a better way. So our goal is to microscopically understand what makes nitrogenase different to iron, so that is making this reaction more favorable. And to understand that, we need quantum chemistry tools, because those are the ones that understand the paths that electrons are following in these two cases. So for example, with quantum chemistry tools, we can already make plots like this, where we're showing the reaction path. So basically, we're seeing what is the progress of the reaction from the reactants that you are mixing together to the ammonia molecule that you can see here has a lower energy than the reactants. So this means the reaction is favorable and it will take place. But for it to take place, you need to overcome this huge energy barrier that becomes smaller if you make the reaction on top of a catalytic surface. So if you make it in the presence of iron, for example, but still you need the 400 Celsius degrees that make it so expensive. So it would be a complete game changer if we could search in a very crazy manner, like completely search chemical space for a complicated molecule similar to nitrogenase that can help us make this reaction in a much more efficient way. And the reason why we cannot do this is because our current quantum chemistry toolkits is not efficient and is not reliable enough to do that. And like this, there are other many more questions that you might be interested in, and that some are deeper than others. We can care about how to make the perfect coffee roast, or we can wonder how can we store more energy in our batteries so that instead of having electric cars, we could imagine of having electric aeroplanes, which would be amazing, right? Or we can think of how to make more efficient solar cells. And all these questions in the end will be answered by designing better molecules and better materials, which are in the end just collections of atoms. So we want to understand how collections of atoms behave. But if we look at that in detail, here I'm showing 3 atoms of hydrogen, like the ones in the ammonia molecule, and one is moving towards the others in something that is similar to a chemical reaction. But if we look one level below that, here you can see a set of dancing electrons in blue and pink, which are the ones that are actually making the bonds and breaking the bonds between the atoms. So the electrons are the ones underpinning and governing this chemical reaction. So in the end, if we want to understand collections of atoms, we have to understand the quantum mechanics of electrons. So just to recap this first part, I hope I've convinced you that equations for how electrons and nuclei interact underpin all modern science. And we need more efficient tools to describe quantum mechanics so that we can understand the dynamics of very complex molecules like nitrogenase, which would, without too much computation, so that we can explore chemical space fast. So in the second part, I want to talk about what is the opportunity we are pursuing here. Our goal, if they ask us what would be ideal, we would like to take any atom arrangement you can imagine, any molecule that exists or that you can invent, pass it through a single universal neural network and get a faithful quantum mechanical description of it. But that's a very ambitious, that's something that's very ambitious, a very ambitious desire, right? Because we're asking to boil down all the complexities in these questions, pass them through a single universal network and get a quantum mechanical description out of them, like get the energy, for example, so that we can make predictions. And therefore you might be thinking a lot of things. You might be thinking, is this possible? Does this neural network exist? If it exists, is it going to scale well? Because I've shown you that the wave function has a problem with scalability. So this neural network might have the same issue. And then there's other questions like, how would you train it? What is the data? What are the inductive biases that are going to help you in this task? And these are the type of questions that I will try to address in this part of the talk. So the first one about, is it possible to model all quantum molecules or all materials that you want to imagine with a single neural network? The short answer is yes, but just to explain it a bit more. So the wave function was this huge monster that was describing the joint probability distribution and was scaling very badly. But some decades after the Schrödinger equation was published, appeared a theorem that proved that is enough to look at the average behavior of electrons to predict the energy of the system and to predict also other properties that are of interest. So basically what that theorem was saying is that you can take the wave function, compute the marginal over all electrons except one, and then you get something that is the marginal distribution for ML people, or we call it the electron density, because the electron density is essentially the probability of finding one electron at a given position. So it's a very simple function. It's just a 3D vector that scales very well with the system size, because it's always a 3D vector, and is therefore something that you can plot. Like here, I plotted the density, the electron density. In yellow, you see where it's more probable to find electrons, and in blue, where it's less likely to find electrons. But this is a very crucial statement that is not trivial at all, and I'm not going to prove the theorem during this talk. But essentially what it says is that you can take the electron density of a system as an input, pass it through a function, a black box, and you will get the energy. Yeah, sorry?
On your previous slide, if you integrate all from R2 to R102, you get the same figure as if you were to keep R2 but integrate R1 and then R3 to all of R.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
Understandable, but particle does are the same.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, so as I was saying, this statement is very important because it connects electron densities with energies, but it doesn't say anything about what to put inside this black box. But just the fact that someone was able to prove that this black box exists was enough for them to be awarded the Nobel Prize. So this introduced a full change of paradigm about how the quantum chemistry community works nowadays. And now there's entire teams that either work using approximations of this black box or work developing better approximations of the black box. And by the way, this black box has a name and we call it the density functional, which gives the name to the theory that I'm talking today, which is the density functional theory. But this theorem said something else. They couldn't figure out what was the exact expression of the black box, but they said you can split it into two parts. So now it's a smaller black box. Because there's a part that is system dependent, which means that every time you change your molecule, that part changes. But that part is easy. We know how it looks like. And it's the one that contains information about the material you are describing. Then there's the second part that is a universal part, meaning that if you change the system you are describing, that part doesn't change. And it takes into account how electrons interact with each other. And that part is very complicated and is not completely known how it looks like. But it means, but by having this machinery, it means that you have a part that describes your material and a part that is unknown and universal. And then with this machinery, you can model all matter by just changing the upper part that is easy and it's known. But if you've been keeping track of what I'm saying, I keep saying that we need the electron density as input and that the electron density is very important. So you might be thinking, where are we going to get the electron density for each system that I can invent? And the answer is also in that theorem that probably was worth the Nobel Prize. This theorem said that also the true electron density is the one that minimizes the energy that is produced as output from this black box. So all you have to do is run your black box machinery in a forward pass to get the energy, and then you can back propagate it to get the electron density. So essentially it means that if you have the density functional, you have all the things you need because you can get both the electron density and the energy. So I mean, this is a very powerful theory, and even though we don't know how the universal functional looks like, the exact form, there's a lot of approximations for it, and they form something that we call the functional zoo because there's hundreds of approximations. Some of them work very well for a particular chemical system, and at the same time, they completely fail for other systems, which means they are not universal and therefore they do not generalize very well. But even given that, this theory is super well used in the materials community and also in other areas of biology. So 12 papers in the top 100 most cited papers in the entire scientific literature belong to density functional publications. And yet we haven't said what to do with a black box that we cannot describe. So of course, our big idea was, let's replace it with a neural network, because neural networks are functional approximators. They are simply functions. So what we're going to do is replace this universal part that describes how electrons behave with a neural network that we hope is going to be expressive enough to generalize very well to the whole chemical space. And then the only thing I have to do is answer machine learning questions, like how are we going to train it? Are there any inductive biases that are going to be useful, etc. So from the training point of view, this is a supervised learning problem, or at least that's how we are treating it. We get that our inputs are the electron densities and our targets are the reaction energies. Here we care about, as I've said, reaction energies, and this means we are going to take differences of energies, and therefore accuracy is crucial for two things, because we care about differences of energies and because chemists care a lot about accuracy in energy, because in some regions of experimental chemistry, the accuracy of experiments is very high, and therefore we need to compete against that level of precision in experimental chemistry. And if we get into more detail, the only thing we need is computational power, because we can solve the equations I've been showing previously, the Schrödinger equation, we can solve it for very small molecules and get very accurate results. Then we use those numbers as input for as training data. So with that, we've built a data set of 10,000 molecules, taking into account data augmentation. So this is not 10,000 different molecules. Yeah, so it's not a very large data set from the machine learning point of view, but we use that as a training set for our model. And then we compute the loss as the difference between the target energy and the predicted energy. The good news, so as I said, the good news are that we just need computational power to generate our training data. But at the same time, the bad news is that that training data only covers a very tiny region of chemical space, while chemical space is incredibly vast. And in general, people that use density functional theory, they want to use it for their favorite system. And their favorite system is always not in our training set, because those might involve very large molecules that are completely different to what we can train on, or that might involve very exotic interactions like the ones that are present in superconductors, for example, or it can involve extended or solid systems that include periodic boundary conditions, which we don't include now in our training data either. So this is a huge generalization problem from the ML point of view. And I will talk later about the inductive biases that we are trying to introduce in our model to help during training, to make the most of the data we have. But before, I want to show how does the architecture look like. So from a deep learning point of view, it's a very vanilla architecture. We have an MLP that is made of 6 layers. Our electron density is treated as a point cloud. So it's sampled on a grid that is a very dense grid, and it's irregular and is different for each input molecule. From that electron density, we build feature vectors at each position of the grid, and then we give that to the neural network that produces an output at each position. Then we integrate those outputs to calculate the energy. So if we go back to starting with the inductive biases, since this is a physics problem, so we have a set of expected inductive biases, like we need to respect the usual symmetries, rotational symmetry and translational symmetry, which we do. But there's another one that we think is more important and it's been harder for us to capture, and is the fact that the true universal functional is global. And by global, I mean that when it has to predict the energy of the molecule, it looks at the entire density of the molecule, which is what I'm doing here. If you compare the density in purple of a trained molecule versus the density of a test molecule, they look completely different. Which means that a model that is very global is going to struggle with generalization because the densities are very different. On the other hand, if you look locally, if you zoom in, here I'm circling hydrogen atoms that are sticking outside of each of the molecules. Our electron densities locally look very similar. And that is the reason why traditionally local models in density functional theory have been very robust and have been able to generalize very well. But of course, they are sacrificing accuracy. So we always have this tension between I want a global model that can generalize and be as robust as a local model, but more accurate. And that is a problem that we still have, and we have fixed it somehow, but I would say we haven't fixed it completely. So right now, the way we are dealing with that is on top of our features that we are obtaining from the electron density and that are evaluated at each point cloud, we are adding an additional layer of feature vectors that have been handcrafted by experts in quantum chemistry. So if anyone knows, these are basically Hartree-Fock terms in case someone knows about Hartree-Fock. So these are terms that capture very well non-locality, and we add them as information for the network to have additional information about the global distribution of the density, which means that the machine learning part is acting locally and is performing only local operations. And ideally, we would like also the machine learning model to be able to learn something more global about the electron density, but that's work for the future.
Sorry, I have a question because
Yeah.
I didn't understand. You add non-locality,
Mm-hmm.
but you add it in a local way since you add it related to a position.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So we add it related to a position, but this at that position, we have before we have performed an integral that has looked at all the points in the cloud. So these are vectors evaluated at each position, but they contain information about the global distribution of the density.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, ask another question.
Yeah.
Do you assume the shape of the position of all the protons is fixed, or isn't that going to be affected by the distribution of the electrons as well?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in general, when you solve the Schrodinger equation, it's very standard to assume that your nuclei are fixed and the only moving parts are the electrons. Because when it comes to a chemical reaction, protons are very heavy and they basically don't move while electrons are dancing all around. So we make that approximation here too. And it's only in some very specific cases where you have to break that assumption, which is called the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. Yeah. Yeah, so up to this point, I've shown you that we are after a very ambitious goal because we're trying to boil down all the complicated quantum chemistry questions into a single universal neural network. But at least we are after something that Nobel Prize winners have told us that exists. So there's a little bit of hope. And I've told you how we have designed our problem so far. So now I will show some of the results we have published. Last year, in December 2021, we published and open sourced our first machine learned density functional, which we call it DeepMind 21. And this functional was important. Well, first it was important because it was the first general purpose machine learned functional. So there had been other efforts outside of DeepMind, but this is the first machine learned functional that you can apply to most of general quantum chemical systems, not to all quantum chemical systems. But it was relevant for two things. One is because it demonstrated state-of-the-art performance in chemistry benchmarks that had been defined by the community, not by us, and we didn't train on those sets. So this was a true evaluation metric. And the other one is because at the same time, we managed to solve some long-standing problems related to charge movement and spin movement that had been opened in the field for a long time, and that they translated into qualitative different description of some molecules, of some processes. Like the one I'm showing here, for example, this is a DNA base pair. And experimentally, it's known that when you have a movement of charge in this DNA base pair, the charge has to be localized on adenine. And charge here is in this purple color. So if you do this calculation with one of the traditional human-designed density functionals, the charge would be partially in adenine, but also partially in thymine. And that is part of the systematic errors that traditional functionals present. While if we do the same calculations with DM21, the charge is located only on adenine. So that is one of the examples of success stories that we have in our paper. And if you care about them, you can just read the paper, but this is one of the nice examples. And just to show the progress that has taken place in the DFT community since the theory was born, this is a progress chart that is evaluating the error on these chemistry benchmarks over time. So around the 80s and the 90s, there was a period of time where progress was very fast because there were lots of new ideas coming into the community. Then we entered a phase of we don't have any better ideas and we're just applying these approximations that we have. and they might enter the game in this blue heart, so in 2018. And we are sitting here right now, so we haven't reached the target that we set for ourselves. And the reason why this is our target is because we believe that if we manage to reach that accuracy, we will be able to replace lots of experiments that are happening now in the labs with quantum chemistry simulations in the computer. So there's some work to do. And therefore, there are some steps that we want to follow. Yeah.
I have a question. So how do you do the ground truth? Like when you get the error here?
Yeah. So these targets are a mixture of experiments that have been performed at a very high accuracy, like people do trust these experiments a lot, and also some wave function calculations. So you can solve the Schrodinger equation doing some approximations, and you get high accurate results, and you can also have an idea of how inaccurate those results are. So those targets come from there. But at some point, as the molecules get larger, we don't have anything, basically. Or we have experiments, which, yeah, hard to trust sometimes. Yeah, so essentially, we want to have better architecture so that we can capture this non-locality that I was talking before in a better way. We also want bigger data sets, and everybody wants bigger data sets, but I think we have a reason, because our data sets are very small, just 10,000 molecules is not very large. And we also want more varied data sets, because we want to be able to train on the whole periodic table, for example. So far, we are only training on the green areas of the periodic table, and we have completely neglected the middle part, which includes metals like titanium, copper, silver, which are very important in the industry, and they are very difficult for density functional theory. So we aim to fix those problems. So just as a conclusion, I hope this slide summarizes that I've tried to share that we are after a very exciting opportunity. We want to use, or we can use, in fact, computational power to solve the Schrodinger equation for very small systems, and then use that as training data for a single universal network that can provide a quantum mechanical description of how electrons behave. And we can use that then to answer important questions like how to make a more efficient, a better fertilizer, how to make more efficient solar cells, and essentially boost materials design. So far, we have already developed and released a machine-learned functional that has shown state-of-the-art performance on chemical benchmarks, but we want to extend that success story to the rest of the periodic table, cover also metals, and also be able to be efficient enough so that we can describe more exotic materials. And that's it. Yeah.
I have a question. So I'm not a chemist, so maybe my question will sound a little bit ridiculous. But
no.
We were speaking about the chemistry reaction with phosphates. And so in all your models, you're trying only to address the electron's position. But so the fact of using this protein, which is accelerating, might also change the conformity of the atoms. And so how can you address this while only evaluating the position of the electron?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So proteins are huge molecules for this type of theory. But what this type of theory could try to do, and that's our goal, is that we only look at the active side of the protein. So there's a big part of the protein that we think is useless from the catalytic point of view, and we will only focus on the region of the protein that is actually helping for the reaction to take place. And that small region is the one that we can model, and is where electrons are going to be jumping from the ammonia molecule to the protein, etc. But so far, it's been very complicated to determine exactly what is the active region that we should be modeling, because, yeah.
Do you think it might be useful to model the interaction between atoms, like attention or graph neonics? Because I think currently it's like the next steps of what about.
Yeah.
I was wondering if they have like kind of interaction with each other.
Yeah. So you're asking if an attention model could be a good model, for example, or?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
thinking like the atoms might have interaction between each other.
Yeah. So certainly electrons electrons are always near a nuclei, but sometimes they are shared between different nuclei, for example, and that could be captured by an attention model. And yeah, I mean, we've been exploring that. One thing that should be noted is those models sometimes need a lot of data to be good. So we need bigger data sets, but yes.
Thank you. My first question is about your training data. Did you actually run like Schrodinger equation on all these data sets, and how much time did it take?
Yeah. So our training data is a mixture of literature values, like values that you can find in the literature, and also we run our in-house couple cluster calculation. So I don't know, are you familiar with couple? So we've been running CCSD parentheses T, and also some composite methods like W2 or W4, these type of things.
Right.
But yeah, that requires a lot of computational power.
Still, it's an approximation.
Oh, of course. Yeah. We have another team in DeepMind sits next to us where they are directly solving the Schrodinger equation, and yeah. So eventually we might be able to work together, or we are in the plan.
Can you go back to this local global thing? Should you understand how the network takes into account the
this type? Yeah. So I mean, it's very hard to decide how to take into account how to tell the neural network to look at the global density and make sure that it's not overfitting and just training on the training set, learning the training set, and then not be able to generalize. So what we've done here, basically, if you're familiar with couple cluster, what we're doing here is we're giving it Hartree-Fock by the local level. So I can show you later if you want, but when you compute Hartree-Fock, you do two integrals. We're stopping at the first one, essentially. But basically what we're doing is we're looking at how electrons interact at a global level, and we are giving it to the neural network as a pre-computed quantity, which is a very expensive pre-computed quantity.
And the output is the energy, or is it the density?
Is the energy. The output is the energy, so it's a single number.
So they relate to which energy? The ground energy?
Yeah, the ground state energy. Yeah.
Yes, and can you get properties of the ground state itself? Or
yeah, so density functional theory is a ground state theory. So you can only predict things in the ground state. So we can predict the ground state energy, we can predict the bond lengths, the angles. If it's a solid, you can predict the lattice constant, the bulk moduli. So all sorts of ground state properties can be predicted accurately.
Can you do materials then?
Yeah. You can describe an extended solid, or yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank
I have two questions. First, at which point we can say that model is a global model and that model is a local model? The second question is about, as you know, no machine learning participates in the device design.
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
The second,
yeah.
as you know, the machine learning participates in the device design.
Yeah.
So the model interpretability help us to get knowledge from the model to help us in the laboratory to create new models. Do you think deep learning will help us to extract this knowledge from this process of prediction, or not?
From this type of in this type of problem?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I will address the first one first. Which I think I have. Oh, when you can tell it's global or local, yeah. So, I mean, that's a mathematical definition. So you can tell a model is local if it's only performing local operations, which means that if you're only looking at point R to predict a property from point R. If a model is said that is global, if to predict a property at point R, you look at R and R prime, for example. So that is the definition of a global model in that sense. And then you can perform operations that act both on R and R prime. That would be a global model. So in that sense, in the DFT community, those are two very differentiated categories. And then you can decide how global in the sense of how far away is your R prime from your R. And that measures how global is your model or how far you can look at. About the second one, it's true that interpretability is very tricky in machine learning, and the bigger the model, the harder it is. But we've been trying to understand a little bit how the training data is impacting our performance by just simply training on this data, looking at the performance. Then we add new data and we see how it looks like. So we have some understanding of what areas of chemical space make the most, like bring us the biggest amount of information. So that is something that we have started to understand. And we have also started to see which types of data we thought were completely different. And we see that actually they have been seen by the network in a much similar way than humans would consider, and they are actually very useful for other areas of chemical space that we didn't think were going to be useful. So that's as far as we've gone, like from the data point of view. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure, I mean, the pipeline, so your neural network takes a density and then outputs an energy. And, but I thought that there was a slide where you mentioned that I actually have to minimize, I mean, I have to look for the density that minimizes the function. Yeah. So there's an additional kind of.
Yeah. That's a good point. I didn't want to add that because it adds another layer of complication, but that's actually true. So as you've said, we need this, we need the neural network that we are building has to be something that we can take derivatives of, and noise cannot be a problem, because by default, if you train a neural network, it gets very noisy when you take derivatives. So we have an additional term that is a type of loss that is actually making sure that we can take derivatives of our network, so that we can predict the density and the energy, because we have to be able to run this in a loop, essentially, as you've said. So get the energy, and then we have to be able to also improve the density, get the energy again. But our input densities, these input densities have been given, computed using a fixed functional, so essentially a human design functional, bit-relief, in case someone is familiar. So we get bit-relief electron densities, and then we build a functional that we can use to improve densities later. Yeah.
So it sounded like, I actually don't have much experience with point clouds, but you have this 3D space that you kind of turn into a grid, right? And the results depend on how you partition the space into the grid, the fineness, the scale.
You're asking me, or yeah? So yes and no. So one thing that we do, our data augmentation is based on that. So for each molecule, we generate the same input 8 times, one for each type of grid that we think is a good type of grid, and that is augmenting our data set and also helping to lose the dependence on the grid. Like we're showing the same molecule 8 times evaluated on a different grid. Having said that, it's true there is always a little bit of dependence on grids, and that's also a problem in DFT in general. Like if you have a very poor grid, you're going to get very poor results. And if you have a very good grid, so yeah, in our case, yeah, we've seen that there's a little bit of dependence on the grid, but it's not a big issue because we do this data augmentation. Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation. My question is about this model or the proposed solution described properly in the interaction, the intermolecular interaction.
The intermolecular interaction? Yeah, you mean non-covalent interactions or like van der Waals interactions or?
interaction between molecules.
Yeah.
In this model, can describe properly this kind of
Yeah. So yeah, those are very weak interactions, if I understand correctly, right? Yeah, we in our training we include that type of some of those interactions. I don't know specifically which one you're mentioning, but yeah, we include non-covalent interactions, which are those interactions that are very weak but very important at the same time. So 1,500 data points of the ones I've mentioned belong to that type of interactions, because we know they are very relevant, and they are also very relevant if you want to describe solids, because it's how bilayer graphene is attached to each other through that interaction. So yeah, it can.
So is your grid density, the points of your grid, related with the density of electrons? You
Yeah.
need to have the more points where the density is the highest?
Yeah, so essentially what we do is we generate the grid following the atoms. So we know the location of the atoms because those are fixed, and then we start building the grid from those atoms, and then it's more dense towards the atoms and less dense as you get further apart from them, because electrons are more likely to be near the atoms than further away. Yeah, so each molecule has its own grid. So essentially each atom defines a grid, and then when you build a molecule, those grids overlap one on top of each other. Yeah.
So next question. So your current data set has 10,000 data points, right?
Yeah.
How much time does it take to generate one extra data point? Just rough idea. And then is your dream data set, is it just like 200,000, 300,000, or kind of millions and millions or billions?
My dream, my dream is like 50 million data points, but it's not happening, I think. So the question about how long does it take to generate one training sample, it really varies, because some of them we just took from the literature. Others, we run them in our computers, and we have computational power, I have to say. So they take just a couple of hours, maybe. That is after some engineering work that we needed to do to make them efficient. But yeah, they can take a couple of hours, or maybe you can spend one day for a very complicated and high accuracy computation. And then about the data size, let's say that if we could reach the 1 million, but with a big variety, that would be a very good, yeah, that would be very good. But the thing is, in the literature, we're not going to find that type of values. Like, I mean, yeah, we have found the values we have found, and even if you multiply that by 10, we're not going to reach the goal we aim to reach. So in the end, we're going to have to do something about it, and we're going to run our own calculations, or someone has to perform experiments, which, yeah, is also complicated. So data is a big problem, and probably the only solution is be capable of running high accuracy calculations in-house. Yeah.
Maybe as a follow-up question, how does this generalize to larger molecules? Like you have your training data has like small molecules, and then you test it for larger molecules.
Yeah.
You see like a good generalization.
Yeah, so it really depends on why the molecule is large. So for example, we train on molecules that are around 30 atoms is the biggest we use for training, and then we can test on something that is 100 atoms large, and we see good results because that molecule maybe is just simply that you've taken, instead of 4 atoms of carbon, you have 60 or 70 atoms of carbon, or you have a chain of hydrogen that is incredibly large. If the reason why your molecule is large is because, for example, you have a metal in the middle, and then that is changing a lot the interactions between the atoms, generalization becomes a harder task, because in the end, the type of interaction of the electrons is different. So, but yeah, in some cases, we generalize very well. That's why we can train on those very tiny, accurate molecules. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you. as you know, the geometry of the molecule is not constant in the real case. But if you want to modulate this geometry according to the state of the molecule, do you use algorithm or you modulate this variation of geometry?
So do you mean like geometry optimization, like changes of the geometry of the molecule or of the grid?
Changing of the molecule, of the geometry of the molecule.
Okay, so when, like in quantum mechanics, if you given a fixed geometry, that gives you an energy, right? So if you change the geometry, that also changes the energy. And that is what happens when a molecule is going through a change, like it's going over a barrier height or something, it's changing its geometry and it's also changing the energy of the ground state. We can do that type of calculations with these functionals, and we use that also as training data. So we can give a molecule that is in this shape and we give it its energy as training, and then we give it in another shape and we also give the energy that
you feed your model with different shape of the same model.
Yeah, if those are reasonable geometries, we do. Yeah.
Okay, there's no further questions. Let's thank Lara again for a fantastic work.